Welcome to this DW Business Special, exploring how companies within the EU are supporting Russia's military. A network of investigative journalists has found that drones and microelectronics sourced and sold by companies registered in countries including Germany are eventually finding their way into Russian hands despite sanctions. I'm joined by Ilya Lozovsky from the Organised Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, OCCRP, which carried out the investigation. Thank you so much for being with us, Ilya. If I can just kick off straight away by asking you, what led you to get looking into this in the first place?
Well, obviously, we and our partners in the network who participated, which includes Russian, Kazakh, and other German journalists, we are very interested in how Russia is able to continue waging its war using components and devices that were made outside of Russia, despite sanctions very clearly being intended to prevent Russia from being able to do that. And there have been multiple reports out there about these components getting into Russia from through various countries, including Kazakhstan, which is basically one of the focuses of this story. So the statistics show that this is happening. There have been some think tanks and researchers who are looking into this as a broad phenomenon. But for this story, we really wanted to be able to show some concrete examples and really show these individual supply chains of how these components are making their way to Russia. So in this story, we focused on several specific examples and traced the companies that are involved and basically showing how, from beginning to end, how the drones and microchips are making their way to Russia.
And we'll get into exactly the routes that they are taking and how that is happening. But let's just talk about how these drones, which are largely, we're talking about commercially available drones, aren't we? And these microchips, how they are being used when they get to Russia.
That's right. So we know that Russia does manufacture its own drones, and that's sort of a separate issue. But in this case, we are talking about consumer models that basically anyone, pretty much anywhere in the world, can go into a store and buy. In this story, we focused on drones made by DJI, which is a Chinese company. It's basically the largest drone manufacturer in the world. And this company has said quite clearly that their drones are meant for peaceful purposes. They said they don't sell their drones in either Russia or Ukraine. But if you look at the data of everybody has seen, these videos on Twitter and elsewhere showing these drones being used, and we can see them being used all the time. So we just wanted to know how they're getting there.
Okay, Ilya, I just want to show a couple of maps just to show how hardware is managing to get from countries like Germany to Russia, despite sanctions supposed to be preventing it from happening. Ilya, I'll ask you to expand on it in a moment. But the OCCRP was able to trace the route of microchips sourced in Germany from Western manufacturers, sold to a Kazakh company owned by the same people as the German supplier, and in turn sold on to Russia. Investigators also followed shipments of Chinese-produced drones, as we've just been hearing about, which were sold by a subsidiary of the Chinese company, DJI, in the Netherlands to a Kazakh company who in turn exported them to Russia. Let's bring back in Ilya Lozovsky from OCCRP. Let's talk about the companies in Europe that are involved. So who are they?
Well, in the case of the drones, as you mentioned, there's a Dutch subsidiary of the Chinese DJI, and we found that they were licensed to import thousands of these drones to a Kazakh company, or rather, I should say, the Kazakh company was licensed to import them into Kazakhstan from the Netherlands. And we looked into this Kazakh company, which is called Aspan Arba, which means something like sky chariot or heavenly chariot. And we found that that company was sending drones to a Russian company that has a sort of similar name, Sky Mechanics. And it's not just the names that are similar. As it turns out, the companies are owned by the same person, and there are other sort of hints that they are one and the same. The phone numbers match. There's a director that matches between them. So essentially, it's the same people in Russia who are taking advantage. I'm sure the Dutch company wouldn't be willing to send drones directly to Russia. So this is kind of a roundabout way that goes through Kazakhstan. And one of the reasons Kazakhstan is frequently used for these schemes is because it's part of a customs union with Russia. So the controls between Kazakhstan and Russia are quite loose, and it makes it a very convenient pathway.
Yeah, and also
and then of course
to
we
some
looked
extent.
at
No, I was just going to say, I mean, Russia is able to exert a fair amount of political pressure on Kazakhstan, isn't it? Which makes it hard for the Kazakhstan authorities to crack down on something like this.
That's right. Kazakhstan's been trying to walk a very fine line of agreeing to try to crack down and not allow any sanctions to be broken. But of course, Kazakhstan historically is closely tied to Russia, and they can't do anything very obviously that will make Putin mad, let's put it that way. And of course, we also looked at sort of the final stage of this supply chain. Once the drones are imported into Russia by this company, where do they end up next? And we also looked at that and saw that they are indeed selling these drones to various nonprofit organizations in Russia that are connected to the war. And these are the kind of organizations that do crowdfunding campaigns, asking Russian citizens to pitch in and send some money so they can acquire these drones. And that's how they end up on the battlefield.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, it all seems quite sort of amateur when you think of it like that, but actually deep down there's a lot going on there. You mentioned in the case of the drones that, one of the key things is that you have companies in different countries that are owned by the same people. And that's also the case when it comes to the chips that are being sold from Germany to Russia via Kazakhstan, isn't it? So who is behind what's going on there?
So in the case of the microchips, it's a similar scheme. In that case, it's a German company that's owned by a Russian couple, and it's sending drones to a Kazakh company that is actually owned by their son. And that was the company, by the way, the Kazakh one was established shortly after the invasion. And then there we also traced, eventually those get imported to Russia and make their way to various defense manufacturers. So that's one of the things I thought was so interesting about what we found in this investigation is, at least in the cases we found, it's not really existing Kazakh importers or companies or intermediaries that are being used. It's actually new ones that have been set up since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began. And as you mentioned, owned by some of the same people that are in other parts of the supply chain. So it's pretty clearly a deliberate effort to use Kazakhstan as a staging area or an intermediary to get these components and drones into Russia without so directly and so obviously, getting around sanctions by sending directly to Russia. And these are pretty small players. We know that the amount of drones
I think what will be surprising to
battlefield.
people, as you mentioned, is that these are companies that have been set up since Russia invaded Ukraine. So how are companies able to be established in places like Germany with such close links to Russia?
Well, the German company has existed for a while, and I think they were probably doing business for a while. And it's the Kazakh element of this chain that's new, because since the sanctions, you have to introduce these intermediary steps.
I see. Okay. Well, actually, I'd like to now just further look at the claims that Kazakhstan is proving the middleman for sanction-busting trade with Russia, because if you look at import and export data, it appears to bear that out. For example, in 2021, before the war, Kazakhstan imported so few drones that it didn't appear in official figures, according to OCCRP. But then in 2022, imports shot up with $5 million worth of drones entering the country, over $1 million worth were then exported to Russia. Kazakhstan's trade in microchips has also changed radically since Russia invaded Ukraine. Its semiconductor imports doubled to over $75 million in 2022, having barely grown at all in previous years. Meanwhile, exports of microchips to Russia increased 70-fold. Yes, I said that right, 70-fold last year. So Ilya Lozovsky from OCCRP, what's the Kazakh government's position on what appears to be happening here?
Well, in general, they say they are doing their best to control this trade. As I mentioned earlier, because they're part of the customs union, it's very difficult for them, which the foreign minister said at a press conference. He appeared with the U.S. Secretary of State at a joint press conference and essentially said, we're doing our best to control this, but because of this customs union, it's very difficult. And it's sort of been, again, widely known that this is happening. Major big companies around the world, they don't want to obviously go against sanctions, but the companies we looked at in our investigation are relatively small players. And the problem is that you can have potentially dozens or even hundreds of these small players in Kazakhstan and in other countries that are in this customs union or are otherwise dependent on Russia. And it's, maybe they would be sanctioned too, but if we're talking about smaller shipments of drones or Companies, maybe some of these small players might not even be scared of sanctions because they don't do business with the United States, for example. So while the big Chinese drone manufacturer DJI is being very careful about saying, no, we don't sell our drones there, through these various tiny intermediaries that can pop up, and they can pop up quite easily, the trade continues.
As you mentioned there, actually, China is also wrapped up in this to some extent, isn't it, with those DJI drones finding their way to Russia. Is that something that Beijing is okay about? Because obviously it's a very politically sensitive issue, the idea of arming either side.
That's right. China's been also trying to walk a pretty fine line. I mean, they are obviously one of Russia's biggest allies. Russia is very dependent on Chinese trade to keep its economy going because of Western sanctions. At the same time, I think China doesn't want to be too open in flaunting Western efforts to isolate Russia. So they're not necessarily, okay with sending arms or something directly to Russia. And again, in the case of DJI, because it's such a big world company, I think they have interests outside of Russia. They want to make sure they can keep selling their products in Europe, in the United States, and everywhere else, which in any hobby shop you can find their products. So it's not always so much even the endpoint the manufacturers. In addition to the drones, we're talking about microchips. These are chips from big companies like Texas Instruments, Analog Devices, other big Western manufacturers. They don't always have control over where their products end up.
Governments like the Dutch government and the German government are obviously not going to want to see this sort of thing happening within their jurisdiction, the circumvention of sanctions that they themselves have instigated. So is anything happening in either of those countries to prevent what the OCCRP has uncovered?
As far as these specific cases that we uncovered, I haven't seen any specific reactions. Maybe there's something happening behind the scenes. As I mentioned,
is there pressure being put on Kazakhstan to not play this intermediary role?
Pressure, certainly by the United States. That was one of the topics that Secretary of State Blinken mentioned when he was there. There was the recent G7 summit in Japan where sanctions and trying to strengthen sanctions was discussed by those countries. So broadly, there is an effort happening. I just think that sometimes these examples really are able to fly under the radar because they're small and because there's it takes a lot of resources even to do just this investigation. You have to look at the company records, you have to look into who's connected to whom, and sometimes it's very not obvious and you have to use some pretty tricky sourcing. And in the end, we did that and we came up with these examples, and I'm sure there are many more that we haven't seen. And it's not clear, as journalists, our resources to do this kind of research are limited, even though we think this is very important. Governments potentially have more resources to do this, but I'm not sure that they would really be able currently to put a stop to it completely. Although I know that at least in the West, it's something they're looking at, and maybe something will change.
Okay, Ilya Lozovsky from the Organised Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, OCCRP. Thank you so much for your work on this, and thank you also for joining us here on this DW Business Special.
Thanks very much for having me.
And if you've enjoyed watching this, then please do stay here on the DW News YouTube channel and watch some more of our work. You can find plenty more from DW Business right here, and we'll see you over whatever you choose to watch next.